Imagine this. You're at the northern Rhodesian border, 1918. Under the boiling African sun, a small, ragged, and tattered army approaches. A mixture of German officers and African soldiers. Their equipment and uniform is matched and seemingly taken from every local power. They may look haphazard, but they are a highly effective fighting force. At their head is a tall German commander in a slouch hat. The sun glints off his glass eye, while he wears looted boots that would have been too small for him if he hadn't slit the ends so his toes now stick out. World War I is almost over in Europe, yet here in Africa, one German general remains undefeated, and British territory is about to be invaded for the first time in the whole conflict. Hi, I'm your host James Martin, and this is Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
when two balls clash, the grass gets flattened. The battle for East Africa in World War I. For our first episode, I'm focusing on the campaign which led me to create this podcast in the first place. Until Zach Twombly's Versailles Treaty series in his When Diplomacy Fails podcast, highly recommended by the way, I'd never heard of Paul von Lettow Vorbeck or an East African front in World War I. Yet arguably both the man and his campaign are one of the most fascinating parts of the war. In popular history, some remember Lettow Vorbeck, while the famous film The African Queen fictionalises part of this struggle. Yet the East African theatre seems strangely forgotten. World War I East Africa was vastly different from the stalemate trenches and mass armies of the Western Front. Instead, relatively small armies fought a war across vast distances. Troops trekked through jungles and deserts, climbed mountains and descended into deep valleys. Logistics were almost impossible, while wild animal attacks and disease were often more lethal than the enemy, all with the ever-present threat of an ambush hanging over you. First, let's set our scene. During the 19th and early 20th century, Africa was partitioned by the European powers in the scramble for Africa. The part that we're interested in is German East Africa, also called Tanganyika. This covered modern Tanzania, Rwanda and Burundi, forming roughly a rectangle in eastern Africa. Surrounded by British Uganda and Kenya, the Belgian Congo and Portuguese Mozambique, the Germans were hemmed in, but they still had desires for a larger empire across Central Africa, a Middle Africa or Middle Africa to replicate the one they wanted to build in Europe. Britain too had imperial dreams of an African empire stretching from the Cape in South Africa to Cairo in Egypt. Only German East Africa really stood in their way. Now, with the coming of World War I, Germany's other colonial possessions around the world were easily overrun by the Allied powers. German East Africa was in a bind. Surrounded by enemy territory, far away from the Reich and vastly outnumbered, the colony seemed doomed. The Germans, though, actually had some important advantages. First, the local British commanders were unimaginative, lethargic, overconfident and more interested in fighting among themselves than the enemy. Even by the poor standards of World War I, British military leadership managed to set new lows here in the East African theatre. For Brigadier General Richard Wapshire, who had the distinctly unintimidating nickname of Wappy, of whom it was said, "He has little military instinct and is nervous of all responsibility, maybe because he is hopelessly ignorant on all subjects connected to his profession." Right up to the British consul of East Africa, Norman King, who reported brutally that the Germans had no stomach for fighting. The worst of the bunch has to be Major General Arthur Edward Aitken, an old Indian hand, more concerned with his soldiers' appearance than their battle readiness. At his first staff meeting he even announced, "I will not tolerate the appalling sloppiness in dress allowed during the late war with the Boers." You'll be hearing a lot more about General Aitken later. He is literally the stereotype of an upper-class, uncaring, overconfident, incompetent British officer brought to life. On top of this commanding competence, the troops sent to East Africa were definitely the Z-Team. Trained only to put down local revolts, they had no experience of fighting outside India or against a determined opponent. Captain Richard Meinerhetzengagen, chief of British intelligence in East Africa, summed them up disgustedly as the worst in India. Rotten. Despite these shortcomings, sheer overwhelming numbers on the British side might have won the day, if not for the Germans' other great ace in the hole. Their commander, Paul von Lettow Vorbeck, who we met at the start of this podcast. From now on, I'll be calling him Letty for brevity's sake. I just don't fancy saying von Lettow Vorbeck multiple times. Born into a minor German aristocratic family, he followed the traditions of his class and joined the Imperial German Army. This was something of a golden period for the German army, who basked in the glow of their great victories over Austro-Hungary and France, which had led to the creation of a unified German empire. Letty would often reminisce of seeing the famous General Moltke and other legends of that period, and would be deeply influenced by this period of his life. He would become the epitome of the Imperial Prussian German general, both the good traits and the bad. As his lifelong friend, Danish author Karen Blixen said, "He belonged to the olden days, and I have never met another German who has given me so strong an impression of what Imperial Germany was and stood for." He went on to have an exciting career across Germany's colonial empire, first helping to crush the Boxer Rebellion in China, where he developed a deep respect for Chinese culture, but ironically, considering his future, a hatred of guerrilla warfare, which he hoped he'd never have to deal with again. Fate had other plans for Letty, though. He would once again be thrust into another counterinsurgency campaign, this time in German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, commanding troops in the wars and later genocide against the Herero and Nama peoples. It was during this period he was shot multiple times during a gun battle and lost the sight in his left eye. He came out of these conflicts an expert on waging guerrilla wars in Africa, especially from his interrogations of leading rebels. Promoted to lieutenant colonel and placed in command of the Schutztruppe, or Protectorate Force, or colonial forces, in German Cameroon, fate intervened again, and he was suddenly ordered to Tanganyika at the last minute. It's really interesting to think what might have happened if he'd stayed in Cameroon instead. As the British leadership dithered, Letty took the initiative. His aim was to tie down as many British troops as he could to keep them away from the all-important Western Front. Towards that aim, he surprised the British and went on the offensive. Unlike the British forces at this time, he could rely on these excellent African troops, also called askari, well adapted to the local climate and local diseases, highly experienced in bushfighting and almost totally loyal to Letty personally. They were proved to be the best guerrilla fighters, perhaps, in history. Letty began targeting the vital British railway line that ran from the port of Mombasa in Kenya to Nairobi, and then on to Lake Victoria deep in the African interior. In just one 2-month period, 30 trains were derailed and 10 bridges destroyed. Faced with this level of sabotage, more and more British troops became bogged down in static positions, guarding the vulnerable railway line, leaving the initiative firmly with the Germans. The increasingly beleaguered British command decided they had to strike back hard. On paper, the plan looked deceptively easy. They would target the most developed and most populous part of Tanganyika in the northeast, via a large-scale amphibious landing near the port of Tanga, and then overwhelm the Germans with sheer numbers. Not the most elegant of plans, I have to admit, but it could have worked. On November the 3rd, 1914, 9,000 British Empire troops landed unopposed near Tanga and began advancing towards the city. However, what appeared an easy victory on paper quickly began to turn into a fiasco. It started with the element of surprise being completely lost. General Aitken, yes, that General Aitken, made no attempt to conceal his plans. The Royal Navy then decided that due to a previous gentleman's agreement on the neutrality of Tanga, the honourable thing to do was to give the Germans warning of the upcoming attack and ask them to surrender. An anonymous British officer summed up what happened next in a letter after the battle. Tanga was practically empty. The Germans, on being asked to surrender, got 12 hours. Not having got their defences perfected and men down from up country, they asked for 12 hours more and got it. Still, Letty only had 1,000 troops and was outnumbered 8-1. Surely he couldn't win. Now, the disaster of the Battle of Tanga began to unfold. Imagine the scene. You're marching towards Tanga with bands playing and expecting little resistance. You've been assured this will be an easy victory. Unused to the bush terrain, your formations begin to break up and lose cohesion. Suddenly, machine gun and rifle fire erupt from hidden locations. Panic seizes your fellow unexperienced soldiers as you begin dropping like flies. First, the African porters flee. Your officers try to rally their troops, but start getting picked off by snipers. Morale collapses. First a trickle, then waves of soldiers begin fleeing back to the British beachhead. Devastation left behind. A disgusted British soldier exclaimed that, "These are jolly fellows to go fighting the Germans with," as the army licked its wounds at the end of the day's fighting. Aitken, however, remained blithely optimistic. Setting up his headquarters in a house across the bay, far from his troops, he leisurely plotted the next day's moves, settling for an attack en masse all on the front. No thought to a misdirection, of course, but only after a good breakfast. Letty, on the other hand, spent the night reconnoitring the battlefield, with a bandolier across his chest and pistols on his hips. Observing the British beachhead lit up by moonlight, he lamented that he had no artillery to bombard them with. Here, in the brilliant moonlight, at such close range, the effect would have been annihilating. The next day's fighting went even worse for the British. Again, the untested troops fled under intense German fire, while even nature seemed to turn against them. Man-made beehives, high up in the trees, were disturbed by stray bullets, and thousands of angry bees swarmed the soldiers below. The North Lancashire Regiment soldiers suffered dozens, and in some cases hundreds, of bee stings. Just imagine these poor men dodging bullets in combat, and then suddenly being attacked by a horde of angry bees. One officer, knocked unconscious by a German bullet, was actually stung awake by the bees and staggered back to the beachhead. Due to this, the Battle of Tanga is also known as the Battle of the Bees. British propaganda and veterans of this battle would blame the bee attack on a sneaky Hunnish trick, with one soldier complaining that, "We don't mind the German fire, but with bees stinging our backsides, things are a bit hard." Actually, it was just an unfortunate accident. The Germans also suffered at the hands of the bees, but just got off a bit lighter. With the British forces in chaos, Letty decided to counterattack, despite being massively outnumbered. As he later recalled, "The whole front jumped up and rushed forward with enthusiastic cheers. In wild disorder, the enemy fled in dense masses, and our machine guns, converging on their front and flanks, mowed down whole companies to the last man." Completely routed, the British troops fled. In a mark of Askari contempt, some of the Indian troops were found lying dead, with their own bayonets protruding from their backs. By nightfall the battle was over, and a broken and beaten British army either hid in the mangrove swamps or tried to find their way back to the relative safety of their beachhead. In true Aitken style, he withdrew to a transport ship for a good night's sleep, rather than looking after or rallying his army. He professed to be fed up with the whole campaign and would later get his wish to be demoted to colonel and placed on half pay without active duty for the rest of the war. I really think he should have been court-martialed, but I'm not an expert on British military justice. Despite being massively outnumbered, Letty had inflicted a devastating defeat on the British, with 800 dead, 500 wounded and 700 taken prisoner, all at a cost of just 15 Germans and 54 Askaris. The hasty British evacuation also led to 12 machine guns, 600,000 rounds of ammunition, and hundreds of rifles being left behind, which were looted by the Germans. Before Tanga, Letty's forces were well trained but poorly supplied and had out-of-date weaponry. Now, mainly thanks to Aitken, they had become a much more dangerous foe. As the British absorbed the shocking defeat at Tanga, more bad news would soon be on the way. Not content with his stunning victory against all the odds, Letty went on the offensive and attacked the British border town of Jessini. Close to the German railway system and a perfect land base for another attack on Tanga, it was a clear and present danger that needed to be neutralised. Rather than try to take the town by storm, Letty besieged it, while laying a trap for British forces trying to relieve the garrison. Repeated relief missions were torn apart by well-concealed German machine gun nests, while hunger and dehydration worked their baleful magic on the British garrison. Finally, the garrison surrendered to Letty's force, which was only half its size. You may have noticed the war in East Africa seems pretty conventional at the moment, yet earlier on this episode I've been describing it as a guerrilla war. This is the point where it begins to change. While Ticino was a stunning victory, it had also been a costly one for the Germans as well. Letty realised that he was going to fight a long war. Guerrilla tactics were the way forward. With Britain unable and unwilling to risk another great defeat, Letty continued to launch raids into Kenya and Uganda throughout 1915, as the war in East Africa entered a quiet period. The major action would take place on the water, ironically, as the German cruiser Königsberg attacked Allied shipping in the Indian Ocean. While the Königsberg was eventually sunk in July 1915, even this was somewhat of a Pyrrhic victory for the British. Letty was able to salvage the cruiser's main battery guns, and they would be used for many years on land. The real action would take place on Lake Tanganyika, in the west of German East Africa, bordering the Belgian Congo. The largest freshwater lake in the world, it was completely dominated by German naval forces, and prevented both the British and the Belgians from advancing into central Tanganyika. They needed to break German control over the lake. However, neither had the ships necessary to challenge the strong German fleet. The British now achieved something amazing. 2 motorboats were hauled 3,000 miles through the jungle and desert to the shores of Lake Tanganyika, mostly by thousands of African porters, taking the Germans completely by surprise. The newly named HMS Mimi and HMS Tutu slowly destroyed the German fleet, with their last ship, SMS Graf von Gotzen, finally being scuttled by the end of 1915. Ironically, this ship was later refloated and now serves as a ferry, the only German Imperial Navy ship still sailing today. This is one of those facts that I just love to find out. Seriously tempted to holiday to Tanzania just so I can sail on it. With Lake Tanganyika secured, Britain and her allies prepared for what they hoped would be a final showdown with Letty. While the initial campaigns had mostly been a British and Indian affair, from 1916 there would be an increasing Africanization of the fighting, though it still continued under a British flag. A legendary figure would now enter the fighting, South African General Jan Smuts, leading an 8,700 strong South African expeditionary force. There was probably no better general in Africa to send against Letty. Smuts had fought the British in the Boer War in South Africa as a commando leader, so he was an expert on guerrilla warfare. Forceful, aggressive and cunning, he was the exact opposite of Aitken and Wappy. Soon he would serve in the Imperial War Cabinet, and went on to become South Africa's leading statesman, a personification of the accord reached between the former foes, Afrikaners and the British Empire. That was in the future, however. For now, Smuts' task was to defeat Letty. Letty and the Germans now faced one of the worst periods of their campaigning. Determined to avenge Tanga, the British had built up a huge force of 45,000 men by the spring of April 1916. Against this, Letty could only muster 6,000 German troops as a sledgehammer came towards him. The British army poured across the Kenyan border, taking the more developed northeastern part of Tanganyika and cutting the German railway system, while another British force invaded the south, crossing over from northern Rhodesia. To add to Letty's woes, the Belgians also invaded from the Congo. Outnumbered and facing foes on all sides, Letty increasingly turned to ambushes and rearguard actions, never risking a conventional battle if possible. Despite his heroics, he was now truly cut off from the world as the Allies overran the key cities and railway lines. This is where the conflict truly became the guerrilla war it is remembered as today. A letter from Captain Alexander Wallace to his fiancée in September 1916 really reveals what it was like fighting in such inhospitable terrain against a determined and cunning enemy. When marching along the road, the Germans opened up on us with Maxims, machine guns. Our cow guns, as they are called, because they are pulled by cattle, came up, and after about 40 shells, shifted the Germans. I went out afterwards and brought in 2 wounded German Askaris. The country here is so mountainous that it's very easy for the Germans to leave a small rearguard to hold us up. The scenery is magnificent. Huge tree ferns all along the valleys and the hills, covered with thick bush, which you can't get through without cutting down. We also marched through a succession of swamps and pushed up on a steep pass through the mountains. Our men had just got to the top when they were fired on, and for a time there was a regular duel. We had 2 men hit. Altogether in 3 days scrapping, we've had about 40 casualties. It had become a war of endless slogging through harsh terrain, punctuated by ambushes and brief firefights, with an elusive enemy who always seemed to get away. While Letty was definitely on the run, he spotted a key weakness in the Allied strategy. The very size of the Allied forces, the lack of infrastructure, and the vast, inhospitable countryside meant logistics became an almost unsolvable nightmare. As the saying goes, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. Letty deliberately led the British into the harshest parts of the country, where they had to cut loose from their supply lines. Supplies could only be transported by tens of thousands of African porters, who also needed foods and medicines, further straining limited supplies. British troops frequently were reduced to starvation rations and medicine shortages. Letty's troops further added to this lethal brew by exploiting or destroying all food resources in the area, leaving it barren for the British so they could not live off the land. In these circumstances, the inevitable began to happen. Among the malnourished troops, disease began killing far more than the Germans did. The 9th South African Infantry began the campaign with 1,135 men in February 1916. By October of the same year, they were down to just 116, and that's having barely engaged the enemy. For every man the Allies lost in battle, a further 30 were lost through sickness. 50,000 African porters also died during the conflict, probably the most forgotten victims in an already forgotten conflict. As far as I can find in my research, no memorial has ever been built to them. The combination of scorched earth tactics and hungry armies trying to live off the land began a famine that would also take hundreds of thousands of African lives. In 1919, Ludwig Depp, a doctor who campaigned with Letty, lamented that, "Behind us we leave destroyed fields, ransacked magazines, and for the immediate future, starvation. We are no longer the agents of culture. Our track is marked by death, plundered and evacuated villages, just like the progress of our own and enemy armies in the 30 Years' War." The picture I have painted of Letty so far is of a military genius and great leader, and he certainly was. But as I said, he represented both the best and some of the worst aspects of the Imperial German Army. He also had the same disregard for civilians that seemed embedded in the German officer corps. His whole approach to this conflict was to prioritise his forces, and while militarily I'm sure you can make an argument that was correct, it would have a devastating effect on the local population. The same with his scorched earth tactics. While they were effective, they took an awful toll on the locals in the name of a faraway conflict, in which wasn't really their fight. Isolated from the world, Letty's forces became increasingly self-reliant. Motor fuel was made from coconuts, boots from the skin of cattle, and a miniature weaving industry for uniforms created. Quinine, the all-important drug used to treat malaria, was made from wood bark. It was jokingly known as Lettow snaps. I had to admit I love that, Lettow snaps, and tasted so foul some soldiers said they would prefer the disease to drinking it. What they couldn't make themselves, they looted from the British. Both his German and his Scottish soldiers were incredibly loyal to Letty, and relatively few desertions occurred, despite the increasingly difficult situations. His treatment of his African soldiers was incredibly progressive for a European officer. He'd learnt the local language of Swahili, he'd appointed black officers, and frequently stated that, "We are all Africans here," in the words of one historian. It's probable that no white commander of the era had so keen appreciation of the African's worth, not only as a fighting man, but as a man. Honestly, when I think of the sheer loyalty of his soldiers to him as an individual, the only time I can really think of it being comparable is to Hannibal's troops, where despite the later stages of the Punic Wars where they were doing badly, they still remained almost absolutely loyal to him. Despite Letty's brilliance, the Germans were slowly forced into a long retreat into southern Tanganyika by 1917. Jan Smuts had now left for London to join the War Cabinet, and a new South African general had taken over, Sir Jacob van Deventer. Hopes were high that victory was close and that the Germans would finally be crushed. The British Empire forces had now become almost completely an African force, led by white South African officers. This was due to Africans being more resistant to the diseases that had killed so many European and Indian soldiers early in the war. Despite overwhelming numbers and far better commanders, the upcoming Battle of Mahiwa would not be the great success the British had hoped for. Rather like what was happening on the Western Front in 1917, commanders still hadn't learned not to throw men against well-positioned machine guns. Out of an original British force of 6,000 men, 2,700 were either killed or wounded before they were forced to withdraw. The battle was noted by the British official history as the most disastrous day for the Nigerian army since the formation of the force, and was called the most savage battle in the history of African conflict. And that's honestly saying something if you look at many of the colonial struggles that happened around this period. Lettow's Germans hadn't escaped unscathed, though. Out of 3,000 men deployed, 600 had been killed or wounded, 30% of his force. They were also dangerously low on ammunition and food. A crunch point had been reached. Just imagine this. As the sun sets on the African savannah, a solitary figure sits in contemplation. Surrounding him are his loyal soldiers, awaiting their commander's decision. For 3 long years they had caused havoc among Allied forces, all the while being vastly outnumbered. But now, while their morale remains high, they are slowly being pinned down. Honour has been satisfied. They could surrender, or they could take a leap into the unknown and continue the struggle. Like Julius Caesar at the Rubicon, the commander has a decision to make: to stop, or to march on into history. As stars appear in the sky, their commander stirs. There's a gleam in his one good eye as he speaks. There is almost always a way out, even of an apparently hopeless situation, if the leader makes up his mind to face the risks. The decision is made. They're going to leap into the unknown. To replenish his supplies, Lettow chose to invade nearby Portuguese Mozambique. Mind map time. Imagine a capital Y. That is what Mozambique looks like. The top of the Y shape borders Tanganyika, and is the right-hand side of the Y that Lettow is about to invade. Lettow had no intelligence or local knowledge. It was a real leap into the dark. However, he had 2 great advantages. The Portuguese had a strong army in the colony, but as their rule was very unpopular, their army of over 7,000 men was split into hundreds of small units throughout the country to maintain order. Most of all, they had no idea he was coming. Lettow completely reorganized his force in preparation for the upcoming campaign. Doctors selected the healthiest men, not necessarily the best soldiers, but definitely the healthiest, to survive the upcoming campaign, and formed a reduced but elite force of 300 Europeans, 1,700 Ascaris, and 3,000 native carriers. They would be independent of supply dumps and could rely only on what it could capture. Crossing the border of his target was the well-supplied Portuguese force at Nigomeno. While forewarned by the British, the inexperienced force was expecting a frontal attack. Instead, Lettow used the forests to hide his army as he attacked from the rear. Completely taken by surprise, the Portuguese were further demoralized when their commanding officer was killed early in the fighting. Morale collapsed, and soon Lettow had won yet another great victory. At the cost of only 4 dead, he had killed 200 Portuguese and taken 700 prisoners. Best of all, they had captured 250 rounds of ammunition, 6 machine guns, and several hundred rifles. Completely resupplied, the Germans began their rampage through Mozambique. What followed is best described as a chase. Lettow marched down Mozambique, capturing isolated garrisons and forcing the Portuguese to retreat before him. Behind him, the British pursued, trying to catch up with him. As one of Lettow's soldiers said, "This is a funny war. We chase the Portuguese, and the English chase us." Lettow's army marched 6 hours a day with only limited breaks, looting everything they needed, held together solely by his iron will. Once, when he was fever-ridden and nearly blind, Lettow Vorbeck led his exhausted horse into camp. His adjutant noted, "I am not sure which one more resembled a skeleton. One thing is certain. The horse will not last the next 24 hours. But the colonel, he will." Letty's next step would further build his legend. Having overrun most of Mozambique and needing more supplies, he turned around, avoiding the pursuing British force, and advanced back towards Tanganyika. Honestly, this whole period feels like Letty and his troops just curb-stomping the Allied forces. The British were thrown into panic, thinking he was looking to recruit more Ascaris. A trap was laid in the prime recruiting gown. But it was another misdirection by Letty. He had another target in mind as we finally reached the scene at the start of this podcast. Rather than remaining in Tanganyika, he invaded northern Rhodesia, the only time in the whole of World War I that Germany captured British territory. November the 9th, 1918, he overran a supply dump at Kasama, solving all his supply problems in one stroke. The Ascaris morale was high. They were well armed, had plenty of ammunition, and were driving 400 head of cattle with them. It seemed like nothing could stop them continuing the fight. In the end, though, only one thing was able to stop Letty. Having reached the Chambezi River, he was informed by the British commander that Germany had signed an armistice. The war in Europe was over. A stunned Letty could not believe Germany had lost the war. His Ascaris wanted to continue fighting, with one begging that, "I have been asked to say this to you, Bwana General. Where do you go now? Where you go, we will go with you. And if this is not the time, then wait until my son grows up to be a warrior, and he will take my place and go with you. We will go with the Bwana General, will we not?" Letty, however, agreed to surrender, marching his troops to Abercorn, where he handed himself over to the British on the 25th of November, ending his epic struggle. Outnumbered and cut off from Germany, he'd achieved the impossible. His army had trekked 300,000 miles across some of the harshest terrain in the world. Over the whole 4-year period, Letty faced down a total of 300,000 Allied forces, with an army that was only about 14,000 strong, and that was at its highest. The British Empire, Belgians and Portuguese had lost 20,000 soldiers. The Germans, only 2,000. Britain alone spent 72 million on the campaign, and take into account that was 72 million in the pounds of the day. That's not like the modern inflated currency. So it's an awful lot of money. It didn't cost the imperial government a penny, as the troops were not paid. In the end, especially for the Ascaris, they'd fought for Letty, not for Germany. Letty would return to Germany to a hero's welcome. He would become involved in right-wing politics, and to his credit, he was probably the only World War I German hero who rejected the Nazi regime and would refuse to support them. He would survive World War II, although he would be impoverished, and it was only due to donations from his former foes like Jan Smuts that he was able to rebuild his fortunes. He would live until 1965. When he died, some of his ever-loyal Ascaris even attended his funeral. Letty's great achievements, however, must not be overshadowed the humanitarian disaster the war caused in East Africa. The title of this episode is an African proverb for the devastation caused when big animals fight, and that's exactly what happened to Tanganyika. 107,000 African porters died serving all sides. The scorched earth tactics started a famine that devastated the local population and caused 365,000 deaths. The malnourished population were then left vulnerable to Spanish flu, in which hundreds of thousands more died. A harsh fate, all due to a forest war in Europe for powers that showed little interest in African civilian life. In the aftermath of World War I, Britain would annex most of Tanganyika, while Rwanda and Burundi would be annexed by Belgium. Unfortunately for Rwanda, this would help sow the seeds of the civil war and genocide that would occur in the 1990s. The economy of the area wouldn't recover to pre-war levels until the early 1930s. World War I in East Africa is overshadowed by the Western Front, and it's seen as something of a sideshow. I find in history books they often briefly say Germany's colonial empire was overrun quickly, before moving on to the famous battles such as Marne, Verdun or Somme. Yet it's a truly fascinating conflict which deserves to be better known. Even in Tanzania and Zambia there are only a few memorials to the conflict. While in Kenya, there is a small museum housed in the reception area of the Tahita Hills Wildlife Safari Lodge. Definitely paying a visit here one day and adding it to my bucket list. I might be going on my own to that one. I doubt my wife will want to come with me, but that's definitely become something I want to see in the future. In honour of Lettow's achievements, I will end this podcast with the Imperial German National Anthem. See you next episode for more Forgotten Wars. Please remember to like and leave a comment.